Miss Marple and the Christmas Ice Skating Party Murder. Welcome back to Velvet Clues, where we unravel mysteries as intricate as the frost patterns on a winter window pane. I'm your host Connor, and today we're gliding into a chilling tale from the village of St. Mary Mead. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment and let me know your corner of the world. Now, settle in as I take you through the eyes of the remarkable Miss Jane Marple, who finds herself investigating a tragedy that turned a festive celebration into something far more sinister. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Frozen Festivities. The village of St. Mary Mead wore its winter coat with particular charm that December. Snow had fallen generously throughout the week, transforming the ordinary into something worthy of a Christmas card. The old pond on the eastern edge of the village green had frozen solid, its surface gleaming like polished glass under the weak winter sun. For 60 years the pond had hosted the annual Christmas ice skating party on December 23rd, and this year promised to be especially memorable. Miss Jane Marple stood at her sitting room window, watching the preparations unfold across the green. Even from this distance she could see the industrious figures setting up bonfires along the shore, arranging tables for hot cider service, and mounting torches around the perimeter that would illuminate the ice once darkness fell. At 76, Miss Marple no longer ventured onto the ice herself, but she enjoyed observing the festivities from the comfort of her cottage. Her maid Florence entered with the afternoon tea tray. "They're saying over 100 people will attend tonight, miss, and there's to be a proper exhibition by that professional skater, the one from London. Catherine Marsh, isn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, accepting her cup. "I understand she's quite accomplished, though I confess I know little about competitive skating." Florence set down a plate of biscuits. "Mrs. Clement at the vicarage says Miss Marsh is very particular about her performance conditions. Had the village council testing the ice 3 times this week to ensure it would hold." As evening approached, Miss Marple bundled herself in her warmest coat and made her way to the pond. The scene that greeted her was thoroughly festive. Families clustered around the bonfires, their faces glowing in the firelight. Children wobbled across the ice on borrowed skates, while more confident skaters traced elegant patterns in the gathering dusk. Christmas carols played through outdoor speakers mounted on tall posts, and the scent of cinnamon and cloves drifted from the cider station. Thomas Reed, the village maintenance chief, stood near the largest bonfire, surveying the crowd with evident satisfaction. A sturdy man in his 50s with weathered features and capable hands, Reed took considerable pride in the safety of village events. Miss Marple approached him with a pleasant smile. "What a lovely turnout, Mr. Reed. You must be pleased with how everything has come together." Reed nodded, though his expression remained somewhat guarded. "Aye, Miss Marple. Ice is solid at 12 inches throughout. Tested it myself this morning with the proper equipment. No concerns whatsoever." Before Miss Marple could respond, a ripple of excitement moved through the crowd. The professional exhibition was about to begin. Catherine Marsh emerged from a small changing tent near the shore, and Miss Marple observed her with interest. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, wearing a costume of deep blue velvet trimmed with silver sequins that caught the torchlight. Her expression carried an air of supreme confidence bordering on arrogance. The crowd quieted as Catherine took to the ice. For the next 20 minutes she performed a series of increasingly complex routines to carefully selected Christmas carols. Miss Marple, who knew little of skating technique, could nevertheless appreciate the skill involved. Catherine moved with fluid grace, executing jumps and spins that drew gasps and applause from the appreciative audience. Miss Marple noticed several people in the crowd whose expressions were less admiring. Harold Price, who ran a small skating instruction program for village children, watched with what appeared to be barely concealed bitterness. Near him stood Marcus Webb, a village council member whose jaw was clenched so tightly that Miss Marple wondered his teeth didn't crack. As 8 o'clock approached, Catherine prepared for her final performance. The crowd pressed closer to the edge of the pond and the chatter died away completely. The speakers began playing Silent Night, and Catherine glided to the exact centre of the pond, where she'd performed all her signature spins throughout the evening. She began her final routine, building toward what was clearly meant to be a spectacular finish. She entered a dramatic spinning movement, her arms extended, her body rotating with increasing speed. The torchlight caught the sequins on her costume, creating a dazzling effect that held every eye. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the ice gave way. It happened so suddenly that for a moment the crowd seemed unable to process what they'd witnessed. Catherine dropped straight down through a roughly circular hole that had opened beneath her, disappearing into the black water with barely a splash. The Christmas carol continued playing, an eerily inappropriate soundtrack to the horror unfolding before them. Screams erupted from the crowd. Several men rushed forward, but the ice near the hole showed alarming cracks spreading outward. Thomas Reed shouted orders directing people back from the dangerous area, while he and two other men carefully approached with ropes and poles. Miss Marple stood very still, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The hole through which Catherine had fallen was approximately 6 feet in diameter, located precisely where the skater had performed every one of her center spins throughout the evening. The edges of the hole showed clean breaks, almost too regular to be entirely natural. 20 minutes of frantic rescue efforts followed, but when the divers finally pulled Catherine Marsh from beneath the ice shelf, there was no hope. Dr. Haydock, who'd been attending the party with his sister, examined the body briefly before shaking his head. "She drowned," he announced grimly. "Got trapped beneath the ice and couldn't find her way back to the hole. The cold would have disoriented her within seconds." Chapter 2. The inspector's assumptions. The morning after the tragedy dawned grey and subdued. The festive decorations around the pond seemed ghastly in daylight, the bonfires reduced to black scars on the snowy shore. Inspector Slack arrived from the nearby town before 9, his motor car churning through the slush on the village roads. Miss Marple, returning from her morning walk, observed his arrival with interest. Inspector Slack was not known for his imagination or his willingness to consider alternative explanations when a simple one presented itself. By noon, word had spread through the village that Inspector Slack had deemed Catherine Marsh's death a tragic accident. Miss Marple learned the details from Mrs. Clement, who stopped by during her afternoon calls. "The inspector says it was a natural weak spot in the ice," Mrs. Clement reported, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with evident relief at being out of the cold. Unusual thickness variations, or perhaps a spring beneath the pond that created a thinner area. He says these things happen despite precautions. Miss Marple poured tea, her expression thoughtful. Did the inspector explain why the weak spot happened to be located precisely where Miss Marsh performed all her centre spins? Mrs. Clement blinked. "I don't believe that came up in the conversation." Miss Marple handed her guest a cup. "You see, I observed Miss Marsh's performance quite carefully. She performed at least 6 routines during the evening, and in each one she returned to exactly the same spot on the ice for her dramatic spins. The hole that opened was not random. It was positioned exactly where she placed the greatest repeated stress. But surely that supports the accident theory," Mrs. Clement suggested. "The repeated impact from her spins weakened the ice until it finally gave way." "That would be a reasonable explanation," Miss Marple agreed, except that Mr. Reed tested the ice that very morning and found it 12 inches thick throughout the pond. Ice of that thickness doesn't develop fatal weak spots in mere hours, particularly when the temperature remained well below freezing all day. After Mrs. Clement departed, Miss Marple donned her coat once more and walked to the pond. Inspector Slack had left a constable on duty, but the young man made no objection when Miss Marple approached, merely touching his cap respectfully. The hole had refrozen overnight, though not completely. Miss Marple knelt carefully at a safe distance, examining the edges where the ice had broken. What she saw confirmed her suspicions. The break was too clean, too circular. Natural ice failure created irregular cracks that spread in unpredictable patterns. This looked almost engineered. She noticed something else as well, tiny indentations around the circumference of the hole, spaced at regular intervals. They'd been partially obscured by the refreezing process, but in the morning light they were just visible. Drill holes, she realized. Someone had drilled through the ice in a careful pattern, then filled the holes with water that froze clear, disguising the structural damage until sufficient force caused the weakened section to collapse catastrophically. Miss Marple rose stiffly, her knees protesting the cold and the awkward position. This was no accident. Someone had known Catherine Marsh's performance routine, had known exactly where she would place her final spin, and had sabotaged the ice to ensure that when she did, she would plunge through to her death. The question was who, and perhaps more importantly, why. She made her way to the village maintenance shed where Thomas Reed kept his equipment. The door was locked, but through the window Miss Marple could see an array of tools hanging on the walls. Her eyes were not what they once were, but she thought she detected drilling equipment among the implements. That afternoon Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Haydock, under the pretext of consulting him about a minor complaint. After the examination, as she was preparing to leave, she remarked casually, "Such a dreadful business at the pond. You examined Miss Marsh, I understand. Was there anything unusual about her condition?" Dr. Haydock considered the question. "Nothing beyond what one would expect from drowning in freezing water." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason," Miss Marple replied. "I simply wondered whether there might have been any indication of foul play." "Foul play," the doctor repeated, frowning. "Inspector Slack is satisfied it was an accident." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "But Inspector Slack is not always correct in his initial assessments, as we've seen in the past." Dr. Haydock's expression suggested he couldn't entirely disagree with this observation. "If you're suggesting someone deliberately caused that ice to fail, Miss Marple, you're talking about premeditated murder." "Quite so," she agreed, "which means someone with considerable planning ability, technical knowledge, and a powerful motive." The doctor walked her to the door, his expression troubled. "I'll tell you this much. Catherine Marsh was not a well-loved woman. I'd heard rumours even before she arrived for the exhibition. Professional jealousies, destroyed careers, that sort of thing." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. As she walked home through the quiet village streets, she reflected that murder by ice failure was remarkably clever. It appeared accidental, left no obvious evidence of tampering, and required the victim herself to trigger the fatal collapse. Someone had planned this with considerable care and patience. The question was, which of Catherine Marsh's enemies had possessed both the opportunity and the expertise to execute such an elaborate scheme? That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, she made a mental list of everyone who'd been alone on the pond during the 24 hours before the party. Thomas Reed, conducting his safety inspection. Harold Price, setting up the performance area. Dorothy Mills, Catherine's manager, marking performance positions. Marcus Webb, approving safety measures in his capacity as council member. And Gerald Marsh, Catherine's estranged husband, who'd arrived unexpectedly that morning. 5 suspects, Miss Marple reflected, each with access to the murder weapon, a frozen pond, and a drill. Now she needed to determine which of them had the strongest motive and the technical knowledge to transform a festive ice skating party into an execution chamber. Her needles clicked steadily as she planned her investigation. The truth, as always, would reveal itself to patient observation. One simply had to know where to look and what questions to ask. Chapter 3. The Skater's Enemies. The following morning brought fresh snowfall, adding another layer of winter beauty to St. Mary Mead, while simultaneously obscuring any remaining evidence at the pond. Miss Marple, undeterred, began her investigation with a visit to the village library, where Mrs. Bantry, one of her oldest friends, served as a volunteer several afternoons each week. "I'm trying to learn something about competitive figure skating," Miss Marple explained, settling into a chair near Mrs. Bantry's desk, "particularly about Catherine Marsh and her career." Mrs. Bantry's eyes lit with interest. She'd always enjoyed a good mystery, and she recognized that look in Miss Marple's eye. "I can do better than books," she said. "My niece follows competitive skating religiously. Let me telephone her." 20 minutes later, Miss Marple had a comprehensive understanding of Catherine Marsh's reputation in the skating world. According to Mrs. Bantry's niece, Catherine had built her career through ruthless tactics that had made her numerous enemies. She'd been accused multiple times of stealing choreography from other skaters, though nothing had ever been proven conclusively. More seriously, several of her competitors had been disqualified from major competitions following doping allegations that many in the skating community believed Catherine had orchestrated. One case in particular caught Miss Marple's attention. A young skater named Sarah Reed had been banned from Olympic competition 5 years ago after a positive test for prohibited substances. Sarah had maintained her innocence, claiming the test had been tampered with, but the ruling stood. 2 years later, Sarah had taken her own life. "Sarah Reed," Miss Marple repeated carefully. "Any relation to our village maintenance chief?" Mrs. Bantry's niece confirmed that Sarah had indeed been Thomas Reed's daughter. The family had been devastated, she reported. Thomas Reed had apparently spent his life savings on Sarah's training and competition expenses. Her disgrace and subsequent death had destroyed him. Armed with this information, Miss Marple's next stop was the small building near the pond where Harold Price conducted his skating instruction program. She found Price cleaning equipment, his movements sharp with barely suppressed emotion. "Mr. Price," Miss Marple began gently, "I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about Catherine Marsh." Price's hand stilled on the skate blade he'd been sharpening. "What do you want to know? I understand you were once her coach and skating partner. That must have been a significant relationship." Price laughed bitterly. "Significant. Yes, you could say that. I trained Catherine for 3 years, developed an entire program of original choreography. We were going to compete together at the international level. Then one day, she announced she was leaving me to skate solo. 6 months later, I saw her performing my choreography, my moves, my artistic vision, claiming it all as her own work. And there was nothing you could do," Miss Marple prompted. "Nothing legal," Price said flatly. She'd made small changes, enough to claim it was different. And who was I? Just an unknown coach from a village skating program. She went on to win international acclaim with work I'd created. My name was never mentioned. Miss Marple observed him carefully. "You were at the pond the day before the party, setting up the performance area. I saw you marking positions on the ice." Price met her gaze directly. "Yes, I was there. And yes, I hated Catherine Marsh. But I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. I wouldn't know how to engineer an ice failure even if I'd wanted to." From Price's studio, Miss Marple made her way to the offices of Dorothy Mills, who'd been Catherine's manager and was still in the village making arrangements for the body's transport back to London. Mills received her in a small rented room above the post office, her eyes red from crying, though her manner remained professional. "Miss Marsh's death must be terribly difficult for you," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "You'd worked together for quite some time." 10 years, Mills confirmed, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I managed every aspect of her career. Bookings, contracts, publicity, everything. Catherine had a gift, but she couldn't have succeeded without proper management. And yet, I understand she was planning to terminate your arrangement," Miss Marple said gently. Mill's expression hardened. "Who told you that?" "It's a small village," Miss Marple replied. "People hear things." Mill stood abruptly and walked to the window. "She'd promised me partnership," she said, her voice tight. "For 10 years she promised that once she reached a certain level of success, we'd become equal partners in her career. I took a minimal salary, reinvested everything in her training and promotion. Then last month, I discovered she'd been negotiating with a corporate management firm in London. She was planning to sign with them and pay me a pittance in severance." "That must have been devastating," Miss Marple observed. "Everything you'd built, everything you'd sacrificed." Mills turned back, her face composed once more. "Yes, it was devastating. And yes, I was at the pond the day before the party, marking her performance positions as I'd done at 100 other venues. But I didn't kill her, Miss Marple. Despite everything, I still hoped she'd change her mind." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Webb, the village council member, appeared at her door looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I understand you've been asking questions about Catherine Marsh. I thought I should speak with you directly." Miss Marple invited him in and offered tea, which he accepted gratefully. "Mr. Webb," she said, once they were settled, "I confess I've been curious about your connection to Miss Marsh." Webb's hands tightened around his teacup. "My son, James, was involved with her 2 years ago. They met at a charity gala in London. James was completely smitten. Catherine seemed to return his affection, at least at first. Then, quite suddenly, she ended the relationship. Not privately, not kindly. She announced it at a public event, made cruel jokes about his devotion, humiliated him thoroughly." "And your son," Miss Marple prompted gently. "James had always been sensitive," Webb said quietly. The public humiliation triggered a severe depression. He had a nervous breakdown. He's only recently begun to recover, and he's living abroad now, trying to rebuild his life. "I'm very sorry," Miss Marple said sincerely. You must have been furious with Miss Marsh. Webb nodded slowly. I was. I won't pretend otherwise. When I learned she'd be performing at our village party, I seriously considered refusing approval for the event. But I'm a council member. I couldn't let personal feelings interfere with my duties. So yes, Miss Marple, I was at the pond approving safety measures the day before the party. And yes, I had reason to hate Catherine Marsh. But I didn't kill her. The pattern was becoming clear to Miss Marple. Catherine Marsh had left a trail of damaged lives behind her, and several of those she'd damaged had converged in St. Mary Mead with access to the murder weapon and opportunity to use it. But which of them had possessed the technical knowledge to execute such a precise and calculated act of revenge? That question, she suspected, would be the key to identifying the killer. Chapter 4. The Estranged Husband's Arrival. The next morning brought another piece to the puzzle. Gerald Marsh, Catherine's estranged husband, had taken rooms at the village inn and showed no signs of departing despite his wife's death. Miss Marple learned of this from the innkeeper's daughter, who delivered fresh eggs to her cottage each Wednesday. He's a strange one, miss, the girl reported. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's been walking past the pond at odd hours. Just standing there, staring at where it happened. Miss Marple found this behaviour sufficiently interesting to warrant investigation. She arranged to encounter Gerald Marsh quite accidentally during her afternoon walk, expressing her condolences with appropriate solemnity. Mr. Marsh, I'm so terribly sorry for your loss. What a dreadful tragedy. Marsh regarded her with red-rimmed eyes. He was a man in his late 30s, well-dressed but with an air of defeat about him. Thank you, he said quietly, though I suspect the village knows Catherine and I were estranged. There seemed little point in pretending otherwise. Sometimes estrangement makes a death even more difficult, Miss Marple observed. All the things left unsaid, the possibility of reconciliation lost forever. Marsh's laugh was bitter. Reconciliation. Yes, I'd come here hoping for that, foolish as it sounds. I arrived the morning of the party, completely unexpected. Catherine was shocked to see me. We argued in her dressing tent before the performance. She made it quite clear there would be no reconciliation, no second chances. She was planning to divorce me, and she'd hidden most of her assets to ensure I'd receive as little as possible in the settlement. And yet you stayed for the performance, Miss Marple noted. Marsh nodded slowly. I don't know why. Perhaps I hoped seeing her skate would remind me of when we were happy. Or perhaps I just wanted to watch her triumph one more time before she destroyed me completely. Where were you when the ice failed, Mr. Marsh? I was near the cider station, Marsh replied. Dozens of people can confirm it. I saw her fall, saw her disappear beneath the ice. It was horrific, and yet he paused, struggling with the admission. And yet there was a part of me that felt, not glad exactly, but a sense of cosmic justice. She'd planned to destroy my life, and instead she destroyed her own. Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. Mr. Marsh, I understand you were on the pond that morning, before the argument with your wife. Several people mentioned seeing you walking across the ice. Marsh stiffened slightly. Yes, I walked out there. I was trying to decide whether to approach Catherine or simply leave. The ice seemed solid enough, so I walked to the centre, stood there thinking. Then I went back to shore and found her tent. But I didn't tamper with anything, Miss Marple. I wouldn't know how, and besides, I still loved her despite everything. I would never have harmed her. After Marsh departed, Miss Marple sat on a bench near the pond, watching the weak winter sun reflect off the refrozen hole. 5 suspects, each with motive and opportunity. Thomas Reed, whose daughter's life had been destroyed by Catherine's false accusations. Harold Price, whose creative work had been stolen and his name erased from his own success. Dorothy Mills, who'd sacrificed everything for a partnership that would never materialize. Marcus Webb, whose son had been publicly humiliated and driven to break down. And Gerald Marsh, facing divorce and financial ruin. But which of them had the technical knowledge to drill through 12 inches of ice in a precise geometric pattern? Which of them understood structural engineering well enough to calculate exactly how much weakening would be required to ensure catastrophic failure under the impact of a spinning skater? That evening, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Slack, who appeared considerably less confident than during his initial assessment. Miss Marple, he began reluctantly. Dr. Haydock has suggested I should listen to your concerns about the ice failure. He says you've noticed some irregularities. Miss Marple invited him in and explained her observations about the too regular hole, the drill marks around its perimeter, and the suspicious precision of the failure location. Inspector Slack listened with growing unease. "If you're correct," he said slowly, "then we're looking at premeditated murder. Someone who planned this carefully, who understood exactly how to make it appear accidental. Someone with engineering expertise," Miss Marple suggested, "or at least access to someone with such expertise." The inspector consulted his notebook. "Thomas Reed would have that knowledge," he said. "He's responsible for village infrastructure, works with structural calculations regularly. But so would Marcus Webb. He's a civil engineer by training, though he mostly does council work now." "What about the others?" Miss Marple asked. "Harold Price, Dorothy Mills, Gerald Marsh." Inspector Slack shook his head. "Price teaches skating, Mills managed Catherine's career, and Marsh works in advertising. None of them would have the technical background for this kind of sabotage." "Unless," Miss Marple said quietly, "unless they consulted with someone who did, or unless one of them has hidden expertise we haven't yet discovered." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she thought. The physical evidence pointed towards someone with engineering knowledge, which narrowed the field to Reed and Webb. But evidence could be misleading. A clever murderer might have researched ice mechanics specifically for this purpose, learning just enough to execute the plan without possessing broader engineering expertise. She needed to examine the actual method more closely to understand precisely what the sabotage had entailed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Thomas Reed's maintenance shed. The tools used to drill those holes might still bear traces of their deadly purpose. Chapter 5. The Tungsten Evidence. Miss Marple woke early the next morning with a sense of purpose. The maintenance shed stood at the edge of the village green, a sturdy wooden structure that housed the equipment Thomas Reed used for his various duties. She'd noticed during her previous observation that the shed had windows, though they were positioned high on the walls. This morning she intended to get a clearer view of what those windows revealed. She set out just after dawn, when the village was still quiet and Reed would likely be at home having breakfast. The snow had frozen hard overnight, crunching beneath her boots as she approached the shed. She'd brought a small step stool from her garden, which she positioned carefully beneath one of the windows. The ascent was precarious for a woman of 76, but Miss Marple had never let age prevent her from pursuing the truth. From her elevated position, she had an excellent view of the interior. The shed was meticulously organized, with tools hanging in designated spots on pegboard walls. She scanned the equipment carefully, identifying various implements used for road maintenance, sign repair, and infrastructure work. Then her eyes found what she'd been seeking. On a workbench near the back wall sat a drill, larger and more industrial than anything one might find in a typical home workshop. Beside it stood a set of drill bits in various sizes, mounted in a wooden block. Miss Marple squinted, trying to see more detail. The door to the shed suddenly opened, and Thomas Reed stepped inside. Miss Marple froze, hoping he wouldn't notice her perched outside his window, but Reed moved directly to the workbench, picked up the large drill and examined it closely. His expression was troubled. He set the drill down and selected one of the bits from the wooden block, a long, thick bit that caught the morning light with a distinctive metallic sheen. He studied it for a long moment, then replaced it carefully. As he turned toward the door, his face was that of a man carrying an enormous burden. Miss Marple descended from her step-stool as quickly as her aged limbs would allow, managing to move out of direct sight just before Reed emerged from the shed. She watched from behind a nearby tree as he locked the door and walked toward the village centre, his shoulders slumped. She waited until he was well out of sight, then approached the shed once more. The high windows had provided useful information, but she needed more detail. The lock on the door was substantial, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to learn various useful skills. She withdrew a sturdy hairpin from her pocket, one she'd modified slightly for just such occasions. After several minutes of careful manipulation, the lock clicked open. The interior of the shed smelled of motor oil, wood preservative, and cold metal. Miss Marple moved directly to the workbench, examining the drill and bits more closely. The drill itself was a powerful cordless model designed for heavy-duty work. The bits in the wooden block varied in size and type, But one in particular drew her attention. It was longer than the others, perhaps 14 inches and noticeably thicker. The metal had an unusual coloration, darker than standard steel, with a slightly golden tinge. More importantly, when Miss Marple examined the cutting edges under the shed's overhead light, she could see tiny fragments of something embedded in the metal. Ice crystals, she realized. Or rather, the residue left behind after ice had been drilled and subsequently melted. She carefully noted the bit's position in the block, then searched the workbench for other evidence. In a small trash bin beneath the bench, she found what she sought: tiny metal shavings, fine as dust, with that same distinctive dark coloration. She collected several of the shavings in a piece of paper, folded carefully in her pocket, then restored everything to its original position and left the shed, ensuring the lock engaged behind her. Her next stop was the village library, where she spent 2 hours reading everything she could find about drilling through ice and the types of bits required for such work. What she learned confirmed her suspicions. Standard steel drill bits would struggle with 12 inches of solid ice. The extreme cold made the ice nearly as hard as rock, and attempting to drill it with ordinary bits would result in rapid dulling or breakage. Professional ice drilling required specialized bits made from harder materials. Tungsten carbide, she read, was the preferred choice for drilling through ice. It was significantly harder than steel, could withstand the extreme cold, and maintained its cutting edge through multiple drilling operations. Tungsten carbide also had a distinctive dark color with a slightly golden sheen, exactly what she'd observed on the bit in Reed's shed. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Inspector Slack at his office. "Inspector," she began without preamble, "I believe I found evidence that will identify Catherine Marsh's murderer." Inspector Slack looked up from his paperwork with interest. "Go on." "The ice was drilled using a tungsten carbide bit," Miss Marple explained. "This is a specialized type of drill bit, much harder than ordinary steel, designed specifically for drilling through ice and other extremely hard materials. Such bits are not common. They're expensive and only necessary for professional work requiring multiple holes through thick ice." The inspector made notes. "And you believe Thomas Reed owns such a bit?" "I know he does," Miss Marple replied. "I've seen it in his maintenance shed, along with metal shavings that I believe came from drilling the sabotage holes in the pond ice." Inspector Slack's expression grew serious. "That's significant evidence, Miss Marple, though I should point out that breaking into someone's shed is not precisely legal." "I entered carefully," Miss Marple said primly. "The door was not entirely secure. In any case, the evidence exists. If you were to obtain a proper warrant and examine that drill bit, I believe you'd find ice residue embedded in its cutting edges. You'd also find that the metal shavings in his shed match shavings that could be recovered from the refrozen drill holes in the pond ice. Both would contain traces of tungsten carbide, which is quite distinctive." The inspector regarded her with a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "You've essentially solved the case, Miss Marple. All that remains is the official confirmation and Reed's arrest." "Not quite," Miss Marple said quietly. "What remains is understanding why. Thomas Reed lost his daughter to Catherine Marsh's cruelty, yes. But why choose this particular method? Why wait for this specific opportunity? Why go to such elaborate lengths when simpler methods might have sufficed? Understanding the why, Inspector, is often more important than proving the how." That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, she reflected on Thomas Reed's face as he'd examined that drill bit in his shed. It had been the face of a man confronting his own actions, weighing them against his conscience. The murder had been meticulously planned, executed with precision, and designed to appear accidental. But now, faced with investigation and impending discovery, Reed was clearly struggling with the weight of what he'd done. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would speak with Reed directly. Before Inspector Slack made his arrest, before the official machinery of justice ground forward, she wanted to understand the human story behind the technical evidence. She wanted to hear, in Reed's own words, why a grieving father had transformed a Christmas celebration into an execution. Chapter 6. The Father's Confession. Miss Marple rose early, troubled by dreams of ice cracking beneath her feet. She dressed carefully and made her way to Thomas Reed's cottage, a modest structure near the maintenance shed. She arrived just as Reed was finishing his breakfast, and his expression when he answered her knock suggested he'd been expecting someone, though perhaps not her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice resigned. "I wondered when you'd come." "May I come in, Mr. Reed? I believe we should talk." Reed stepped aside, gesturing her into a small sitting room dominated by photographs. Miss Marple's eyes were drawn immediately to a large portrait on the mantelpiece, a young woman in skating costume caught mid-performance, her face radiant with joy. "Your daughter Sarah," Miss Marple said gently. She was very beautiful. Reed's eyes filled with tears. "She was everything," he said simply. "My wife died when Sarah was 6. It was just the two of us after that. All I wanted was to give her the life she deserved, the career she'd worked so hard for." Miss Marple settled into a chair and Reed sat opposite, his hands clasped tightly. "Tell me about what happened," she said. "Not the official version. The truth." Reed drew a long breath. "Sarah started skating when she was 5. She had a natural gift, a combination of athleticism and artistry that her coaches said was rare. By the time she was 16, she was training for Olympic qualification. We'd spent everything I had on her training, traveled to competitions, coaching fees. I took extra jobs, saved every penny. It didn't matter. Watching her skate, seeing her happy, that was worth any sacrifice." "And then Catherine Marsh entered her life," Miss Marple prompted. Reed's expression hardened. Catherine was already established, winning major competitions, but she saw Sarah as a threat. Sarah had developed some innovative moves, techniques that were getting attention from judges. At a qualifying event 2 years before the Olympics, Sarah performed brilliantly. Everyone said she'd secured her spot on the Olympic team. Then, 3 days later, she tested positive for banned substances. Reed's voice broke. Sarah had never touched drugs. Never. She was meticulous about what she put in her body. But the test was positive, and despite her protests, despite our appeals, she was banned from competition. Permanently banned. Her Olympic dreams ended in one administrative decision. "You believe Catherine Marsh orchestrated the positive test," Miss Marple said. Reed nodded. Sarah did. She'd seen Catherine near her water bottle just before the test. She was certain Catherine had contaminated it somehow. But we couldn't prove anything. Catherine was too smart, too careful. And who would believe an unknown skater's accusations against a celebrated champion? Sarah's ban stood. She fell into depression. 2 years later, she took her own life. Reed wiped his eyes roughly. "I found her, Miss Marple, in her room, surrounded by photographs of herself skating. Her suicide note said she couldn't bear living in a world where she couldn't skate, where everything she'd worked for had been stolen by someone else's cruelty." "I'm so very sorry," Miss Marple said, and meant it. Reed looked at her directly. "After Sarah died, I became obsessed with Catherine Marsh. I followed her career, read everything about her, learned about the other skaters she'd destroyed. Sarah wasn't her only victim. There were others whose careers ended under suspicious circumstances, always when they threatened Catherine's dominance. I realized that someone needed to stop her, and that someone would have to be me. So you began planning her murder," Miss Marple said. Reed didn't deny it. "I spent 2 years planning it," he said. "I researched ice mechanics, studied structural engineering, learned everything about how ice fails under stress. I knew Catherine performed exhibitions regularly, knew her style of performance. When I learned she'd be coming to St. Mary Mead for our Christmas skating party, I knew it was the perfect opportunity." "Walk me through what you did," Miss Marple requested. Reed seemed almost relieved to confess. "I tested the pond ice that morning, as was my official duty. The ice was indeed 12 inches thick, perfectly safe. But while I was conducting the test, I was also measuring and marking. I identified the exact center of the pond where I knew from studying videos of Catherine's performances that she always positioned her final dramatic spin. Then I waited until evening, after everyone had gone home. I returned with my industrial drill and the tungsten carbide bit I'd purchased specifically for this purpose. It took me 3 hours to drill all the holes." "How many holes?" Miss Marple asked. 32, Reed replied, arranged in a precise circle, 6 feet in diameter. I'd calculated the exact spacing needed to weaken the ice structure sufficiently that the impact of Catherine's spinning would cause catastrophic failure, but not so much that the ice would appear obviously damaged. After drilling each hole, I filled it with water from the pond. The water froze within hours, creating plugs that were nearly invisible, especially in torchlight. The ice looked perfectly sound, but its structural integrity was fatally compromised. And you knew she would spin in that exact spot, Miss Marple said. Reed nodded. I'd watched videos of 50 different performances. Catherine was a creature of habit. She always positioned herself in the dead centre of the performance space for her final spin. It was part of her dramatic style. All I had to do was ensure the centre of the pond was properly weakened. Then I simply had to wait for her to do what she always did, to spin with all her weight and momentum focused on that one spot. The ice held through her earlier performances because she was moving across it, distributing her weight. But for the final spin, she remained stationary, all her force concentrated on the weakened section. The structure failed exactly as I'd calculated. Why the lover's knot? Miss Marple asked suddenly. I noticed you were working on that pattern, the geometric precision. Reed looked surprised. You saw that? Yes, Miss Marple said. The spacing of your drill holes formed a pattern, quite deliberate. Reed's smile was bitter. The lover's knot was Sarah's favourite pattern. She used to trace it on the ice during practice, said it brought her luck. I thought it fitting that Catherine should fall through a pattern Sarah loved. A tribute, in a way. And do you feel justice was served? Miss Marple asked quietly. Reed considered the question. Justice, he said finally. I don't know about justice. What I did was murder, Miss Marple. Calculated, cold-blooded murder. But yes, I believe the world is better without Catherine Marsh. She destroyed lives without remorse, and she would have continued destroying lives if someone hadn't stopped her. Whether that makes it justice or simply revenge, I can't say. Miss Marple rose from her chair. Inspector Slack will be here soon, Mr. Reed. I've told him about the evidence in your shed. Reed nodded, unsurprised. I knew it was only a matter of time. Part of me is relieved, honestly. Living what I did. That's been harder than I anticipated. Miss Marple moved toward the door, then paused. Your daughter loved you very much, Mr. Reed. That's evident in every photograph. I'm not certain she would have wanted this revenge purchased at the cost of your freedom. Reed's eyes filled with tears again. Perhaps not, he admitted. But I couldn't let her death mean nothing. I couldn't let Catherine continue destroying others the way she destroyed Sarah. Someone had to stop her, Miss Marple. Someone had to make her answer for what she'd done. Miss Marple left as Inspector Slack's car appeared at the end of the lane. She walked slowly home through the cold morning, thinking about fathers and daughters, about grief transformed into calculated vengeance, about the long shadow that cruelty casts across lives it touches. Thomas Reed would be arrested within the hour, would face trial for murder, would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. And somewhere, in whatever lay beyond this world, Sarah Reed's spirit might or might not find peace in knowing her father had destroyed the woman who'd destroyed her. Miss Marple, who'd seen much of human nature in her 76 years, found no comfort in that thought. Chapter 7. The Weight of Motive. By afternoon, news of Thomas Reed's arrest had spread through St. Mary Mead like frost creeping across glass. Miss Marple spent the day receiving visitors, each bringing their own interpretation of events. Mrs. Clement arrived first, her face showing shock and distress. Thomas Reed, she kept repeating. I can hardly believe it. He's always been so reliable, so steady. Such a tragedy about his daughter, of course, but to commit murder. Terrible people do terrible things out of love, Miss Marple observed. Sometimes the most devoted parents are capable of the greatest acts of violence when their children are harmed. That doesn't make the violence right, but it does make it understandable. Harold Price came next, his expression complicated. Part of me understands what Reed did, he admitted. Catherine destroyed his daughter, destroyed my career, destroyed countless others. She was a cancer in the skating world. Does that make her murder acceptable? Miss Marple asked gently. Price struggled with the question. No, he said finally, but it makes it comprehensible. I hated Catherine, Miss Marple. I fantasized about revenge, but I never crossed the line from fantasy to action. Reed did. That's the difference between us. Dorothy Mills arrived in the early evening looking exhausted. Inspector Slack questioned me for hours today, she said, going over and over my movements, my opportunity to tamper with the ice. He seemed disappointed when my alibi held. You weren't disappointed that Reed was arrested instead, Miss Marple observed. Mills shook her head. I'm relieved, honestly. Relieved it's over. Relieved I'm not a suspect. But also, she hesitated, also relieved that Catherine faced consequences for what she'd done. Is that terrible of me, Miss Marple? "That depends," Miss Marple replied. "Do you believe Reed was justified in killing her?" "No," Mills said firmly. "Murder is never justified. But do I think Catherine brought this on herself through years of cruelty?" "Yes, I do. She created her own enemies, Miss Marple. Reed was simply the one who acted on the hatred she'd earned. Marcus Webb was the last visitor, arriving just as twilight settled over the village. He looked older than his years, grief etched deeply in his features. "My son called from Switzerland," he said. "He's heard about Reed's arrest. He wanted me to know that he understands why Reed did it, that if he'd been stronger he might have done something similar after what Catherine did to him." "And what did you tell him?" Miss Marple asked. Webb's voice was firm. "I told him that understanding and approval are not the same thing. I told him that Catherine's cruelty did not give anyone the right to murder her. I told him that Reed has destroyed his own life as surely as Catherine destroyed Sarah's, and that revenge is a poison that harms the person who seeks it as much as the person it targets." "Wise words," Miss Marple said. Webb looked at her intently. "But you're wondering if I believe them, or if I'm simply saying what a father should say." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I think you believe them, Mr. Webb. I think you've seen what hatred and revenge have done to Thomas Reed, and you don't want your son to follow that path." After Webb departed, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, reflecting on the day's conversations. Each of Catherine Marsh's victims had expressed a similar sentiment: understanding without approval, recognition that Catherine had earned her enemies without believing those enemies had the right to kill her. It was a nuanced position, one that acknowledged the complexity of the situation while maintaining moral clarity about the act of murder itself. Inspector Slack telephoned after dinner to report that Reed had confessed fully. "He's shown no remorse for the killing itself," the inspector said, "only for the distress his arrest has caused the village. He maintains that Catherine Marsh deserved to die, that he performed a service by removing her from the world." "Will you be charging anyone else?" Miss Marple asked. The inspector sighed. "There's no evidence anyone else was involved. Reed acted alone, planned alone, executed alone. The others all had motives, but only Reed had the means and the determination to turn motive into action. That night, Miss Marple had difficulty sleeping. She kept seeing Thomas Reed's face as he'd described drilling those holes, the methodical precision with which he'd engineered Catherine Marsh's death. It had been a remarkable piece of planning, really, requiring patience, technical knowledge, and absolute commitment. Reed had spent 2 years preparing for a murder that would take less than 2 seconds to execute, the moment when Catherine's spin fractured the compromise, ice, and sent her plunging to her death. What troubled Miss Marple most was not the mechanics of the murder, clever as they were, but the transformation of grief into calculated vengeance. Thomas Reed had been, by all accounts, a good man, a devoted father, a reliable employee, a helpful neighbour. Sarah's destruction by Catherine's cruelty had transformed him into something else entirely. Someone capable of cold-blooded murder, someone who could watch 100 innocent villagers celebrate Christmas while knowing he'd turned their frozen pond into a death trap. The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the church, where she found the vicar preparing his Sunday sermon. "We've had a most distressing week," he said, looking up from his notes. "I'm struggling to find words that might comfort the congregation. They're shaken by Reed's arrest, confused by the violence that's intruded into our quiet village. Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "your sermon might address the nature of justice versus vengeance, the distinction between understanding someone's pain and excusing their actions." The vicar nodded slowly. "Yes, that might help. People are saying they understand why Reed did what he did, but they're also horrified by it. They need help reconciling those two responses." "That's because both responses are valid," Miss Marple said. "We can understand the pain that drove Reed to murder without condoning the murder itself. We can acknowledge that Catherine Marsh was cruel without believing she deserved to die. The world is not divided neatly into villains and heroes, Vicar. Sometimes the villains have understandable motives, and sometimes the heroes commit terrible acts. Our task is to see clearly, to maintain our moral compass even when we sympathize with the sinner." As Miss Marple walked home, she thought about the Christmas ice skating party, now forever transformed in the village's memory. What should have been a joyful tradition had become the site of premeditated murder. The frozen pond that should have supported celebration had given way beneath calculated sabotage, and Thomas Reed, who'd ensured the safety of countless village events over the years, had deliberately engineered the most dangerous event in St. Mary Mead's history. The irony was not lost on Miss Marple. Read had used his position of trust, his responsibility for safety, as cover for creating the perfect death trap. It was a betrayal, not just of Catherine Marsh, but of every person who'd attended that party believing the ice had been properly tested and secured. The murder had poisoned more than just Catherine's life. It had poisoned the villagers' sense of security, their faith in the traditions that bound them together. Chapter 8. The Trial of Thomas Read. 3 months after Catherine Marsh's death, Thomas Read's trial began at the county courthouse. Miss Marple attended every day of proceedings, sitting in the gallery with her knitting, observing the machinery of justice at work. The prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. They presented the evidence Miss Marple had discovered, the tungsten carbide drill bit with ice residue embedded in its cutting edges, the metal shavings matching the composition of material found in the refrozen drill holes, Read's access to the pond and his professional knowledge of structural engineering. They demonstrated how Read had calculated the precise pattern needed to weaken the ice, how he'd disguised his sabotage by refilling the holes with water that froze clear, how he'd waited patiently for Catherine to execute her final spin in the exact location he'd prepared. The prosecution also established Read's motive, calling witnesses who testified about Sarah Read's destroyed skating career, her suicide, and her father's increasing obsession with Catherine Marsh in the years following his daughter's death. They presented evidence that Read had travelled to watch Catherine perform at other venues, had studied her routines meticulously, had accumulated a disturbing collection of newspaper clippings and photographs documenting her career. The defence, led by a London barrister who'd taken the case pro bono after learning of Sarah Read's story, did not contest the facts. Instead, they built their case around Read's state of mind and the provocation he'd endured. They called psychiatric experts who testified about complicated grief, about how the loss of a child could fundamentally alter a parent's psychology, about the obsessive thoughts that could consume someone who felt their child's death had been unjustly caused. They called character witnesses who described Read as a devoted father, a respected member of the community, a man who'd never shown any propensity for violence before his daughter's death. They presented Sarah's suicide note, which explicitly blamed Catherine Marsh for destroying her life, arguing that Read had been acting not from simple revenge, but from a father's instinct to protect other potential victims from the woman who'd killed his daughter. The testimony about Catherine Marsh's character proved particularly contentious. The prosecution objected strenuously when the defence attempted to present evidence of Catherine's history of destroying other skaters' careers, arguing that the victim was not on trial. But the judge allowed some testimony, ruling that Read's perception of Catherine as a continuing threat was relevant to his state of mind, even if it didn't justify his actions. Harold Price took the stand for the defence, describing how Catherine had stolen his choreography and built her career on his creative work. Dorothy Mills testified about Catherine's broken promises and planned betrayal. Marcus. Webb spoke about his son's breakdown following Catherine's public humiliation. Each witness painted a picture of Catherine as someone who left devastation in her wake, someone who'd earned the hatred that multiple people felt toward her. The prosecution countered with testimony from Catherine's colleagues and family, presenting her as a driven perfectionist whose competitive nature had been misinterpreted as cruelty, whose success had bred jealousy among those she'd surpassed. Gerald Marsh, her estranged husband, provided the most damaging testimony for the defence, describing Catherine with genuine affection despite their marital problems and expressing devastation at her death. Miss Marple found the testimony fascinating, not for what it revealed about the legal case, which seemed clear enough, but for what it revealed about Catherine Marsh herself. She'd been, Miss Marple concluded, a deeply complicated woman, talented, certainly, ambitious, undoubtedly, but also capable of remarkable cruelty, willing to destroy others to advance her own success. Whether that cruelty rose to the level of evil that warranted murder was the question the jury would have to answer. The moment of highest drama came when Thomas Read took the stand in his own defence. His attorney walked him through his testimony carefully, establishing the deep love he'd felt for Sarah, the devastation of her false doping accusation, the helplessness he'd experienced watching her spiral into depression and ultimately take her own life. "I felt I'd failed her," Read testified, his voice breaking. "I couldn't protect her from Catherine Marsh's cruelty. I couldn't clear her name or restore her career. I couldn't even keep her alive." After Sarah died, I had nothing left except the knowledge that Catherine was still out there, still competing, still destroying other people's children. And you felt you had to stop her, the defense attorney prompted. Read nodded. I knew if I didn't, she'd continue. There would be more Sarahs, more talented young people whose lives she'd ruin to maintain her own success. I didn't see myself as committing murder. I saw myself as executing justice that the skating authorities had failed to deliver. Someone had to hold Catherine accountable. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. The prosecutor forced Read to acknowledge that he'd had no certain proof Catherine had drugged Sarah's test sample, that his belief in Catherine's guilt was based on circumstantial evidence and Sarah's suspicions. He made Read admit that he'd planned the murder for 2 years, that it was premeditated and calculated, not a crime of passion or a moment of emotional breakdown. He confronted Read with the fact that his actions had endangered every person at the Christmas skating party, that the weakened ice could have given way at any moment, potentially drowning multiple people if they'd been near the failure point. And he forced Read to acknowledge that he'd felt no remorse, that he'd watched Catherine drown while surrounded by horrified witnesses and felt only satisfaction that his plan had succeeded. When the prosecutor finished, Read looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of his own admissions. Miss Marple, watching from the gallery, felt a deep sadness. Read's love for his daughter was genuine, his grief was real, but his transformation into a murderer had not avenged Sarah's death. It had simply added another tragedy to the one Catherine Marsh had initiated years before. The closing arguments stretched over 2 days. The prosecution argued that Read's careful planning demonstrated clear premeditation, that his lack of remorse proved he was a danger to society, and that allowing grief to excuse murder would undermine the entire foundation of law. The defense countered that Read's actions, while legally culpable, were morally understandable, that Catherine Marsh had essentially created her own murderer through years of deliberate cruelty, and that Read's exemplary life before his daughter's death warranted leniency. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: guilty of murder in the first degree. Read accepted the verdict with quiet dignity, showing emotion only when the judge pronounced sentence: life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years. As the guards led Read from the courtroom, he stopped briefly near where Miss Marple sat. "Thank you," he said quietly, though for what, Miss Marple wasn't certain. For understanding, perhaps, or simply for bearing witness. Outside the courthouse, Miss Marple found herself surrounded by reporters seeking her perspective on the case. She had become somewhat known for her role in solving local mysteries, and they were eager for quotes. "Miss Marple," one called out, "do you think justice was served today?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "Legal justice was certainly served," she replied. "Thomas Read committed premeditated murder and will face the consequences the law demands. But true justice, the kind that might have prevented this entire tragedy, that would have required Catherine Marsh to face accountability for her cruelty years ago, and it would have required support systems to help Thomas Read process his grief without turning to murder. So no, in the larger sense, I don't believe justice was served today. We simply witnessed the final chapter of a story where justice failed repeatedly, beginning with Catherine's false accusations and ending with her murder." Chapter 9. The Aftermath of Ice. Spring came late to St. Mary Mead that year, as if winter itself was reluctant to release its grip on a village that had seen such tragedy. The pond remained frozen long into March, though no one ventured onto its surface. The Christmas decorations had been dismantled the day after Read's arrest, and the pond stood abandoned, a reminder of the violence that had occurred there. Miss Marple walked past the pond, on her daily constitutionals, noting how villagers had begun to avoid it, taking longer routes to bypass the site of Catherine Marsh's death. The pond had always been a gathering place, particularly for children learning to skate and families enjoying winter recreation. Now, it stood empty and avoided, as if the ice itself had been contaminated by the murder that occurred upon it. In April, the village council met to discuss the pond's future. Marcus Webb, who'd resigned from the council immediately after Read's arrest, attended the meeting as a concerned citizen. The council debated whether to fill in the pond entirely, to physically remove the site of such horror from the village landscape. Others argued for leaving it as it was, pointing out that the pond had hosted decades of happy memories before the tragedy, and that erasing it would not erase what had happened. Miss Marple attended the meeting and found herself called upon for her perspective. "The pond is not responsible for what occurred there," she said quietly. Thomas Reed chose to transform it into a murder weapon, but it remains what it always was, a body of water that freezes in winter. The question you must ask yourselves is whether you can reclaim it, whether you can create new memories strong enough to eventually overshadow the terrible one. The council ultimately voted to keep the pond, but to cancel the Christmas ice skating party indefinitely. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and troubled everyone, a decision born of uncertainty rather than conviction. In the months following Reed's conviction, Miss Marple observed the ripple effects of the murder spreading through the village like cracks in ice. Harold Price closed his skating instruction program, saying he could no longer bear to teach a sport so thoroughly associated with tragedy in his mind. Dorothy Mills returned to London but reportedly struggled to find new clients, her association with Catherine Marsh's murder making potential performers wary of hiring her. Gerald Marsh sold his wife's estate and disappeared from public view entirely, and Philippa Hayes, the young garden designer who'd been among the witnesses that terrible night, left St Mary Mead for a position in Scotland, telling Miss Marple she needed distance from memories that haunted her sleep. The village itself seemed diminished, its sense of safety and community fractured by the knowledge that one of their own had planned and executed murder while maintaining the facade of normalcy. Parents became more watchful, neighbours more suspicious. The easy trust that had characterised St Mary Mead's social fabric began to unravel. Miss Marple received a letter from Thomas Reed in May, written from the prison where he was serving his sentence. He wrote about his daily routine, his fellow inmates, the endless hours he spent thinking about Sarah and about what he'd done. "I don't regret killing Catherine Marsh," he wrote, "but I regret what my actions have done to St Mary Mead. I turned our Christmas celebration into a nightmare. I used the trust people placed in me as cover for murder. I destroyed not just Catherine's life, but the village's peace. If I could change that, I would. But I cannot change it, Miss Marple. I can only acknowledge what I've done and accept the consequences." Miss Marple wrote back, a brief note expressing sympathy for his situation while not condoning his actions. She told him about the village's struggle to move forward, about the pond standing empty, about the cancelled Christmas party. She ended her letter with a thought that had been much on her mind. "You sought to avenge your daughter, Mr. Reed, but I wonder if Sarah would recognise the father she loved in the man who committed such calculated murder. Children hope their parents will be better than themselves, not worse. Your love for Sarah was never in doubt, but the murder you committed in her name has not honoured her memory. It has simply added your life to the list of lives Catherine Marsh destroyed." In June, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Philippa Hayes had returned to St Mary Mead briefly to settle her cottage lease, and she stopped by to say goodbye properly. "I've been having nightmares," Philippa confessed over tea. "I keep seeing Catherine Marsh spinning on that ice, keep hearing the crack as it gave way. I know she wasn't a good person, Miss Marple. I know she'd destroyed lives, including my father's. But watching her die like that, it was horrible." "Do you think she knew?" Philippa asked. "In those final moments beneath the ice, do you think she understood this was revenge for what she'd done to Sarah Reed?" Miss Marple considered the question. "I suspect she was too focused on survival, too desperate to find air, to think about causes and effects. But even if she had understood, it wouldn't have made her death justice, my dear. It would have simply made it revenge with comprehension." After Philippa departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden, watching the late spring flowers blooming with determined cheerfulness. Life continued, as it always did after tragedy. The village would heal eventually, though it would heal changed, its innocence permanently compromised by the knowledge of what one of their own had been capable of doing. She thought about the tungsten carbide drill bit, now sitting in an evidence locker somewhere. A tool designed for legitimate infrastructure work transformed into an instrument of death. She thought about the Christmas ice skating party, a tradition stretching back 60 years, now cancelled indefinitely because one man had poisoned it with murder. She thought about Thomas Reed, spending what might be the rest of his life in prison, his devotion to his daughter having led him to destroy his own life as thoroughly as Catherine Marsh had destroyed Sarah's. and she thought about Catherine Marsh herself, the woman whose cruelty had set all these tragedies in motion. Catherine had built her success on the ruins of other people's dreams, had advanced her career through lies and sabotage, had shown no remorse for the lives she'd damaged. But did that make her murder acceptable? Did the sum of her cruelties equal the deliberate taking of her life? Miss Marple's answer remained what it had always been. No. Catherine Marsh deserved to face consequences for her actions, but those consequences should have come through proper channels, through skating authorities, through legal means. Murder was never the answer, no matter how understandable the motive. As evening fell, Miss Marple went inside and returned to her knitting, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of needles clicking, yarn flowing, patterns emerging from chaos. Life, like knitting, required patience and attention to detail. One mistake could unravel an entire project, but with care and time, even the most complex patterns could be completed. St. Mary Mead would complete its healing eventually. The pond would freeze again, and perhaps someday children would skate upon it once more. But the village would never forget the Christmas when celebration turned to tragedy, when ice engineered to fail had claimed a life, and when they'd learned that even the most trusted among them could harbour darkness capable of murder. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Reflection. Summer arrived in full bloom, transforming St. Mary Mead into a riot of colour and life that seemed almost defiant after the dark winter. Miss Marple spent her days in the garden, tending her roses and reflecting on the case that had consumed so much of her attention. Inspector Slack visited one warm afternoon, accepting iced tea on her shaded patio. "The case files are officially closed," he reported. "Reed's conviction stands, no appeals pending. He's accepted his sentence with remarkable resignation." "Have you visited him?" Miss Marple asked. "Once," Slack admitted. "He asked me to tell you something. He said to thank you for seeing him clearly, for understanding why he did what he did without pretending it was right. He said that mattered to him, being understood by someone whose moral clarity he respected." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Understanding is not the same as approval, Inspector. I've maintained that distinction throughout this case. I understand Thomas Reed's pain, his rage at the woman who destroyed his daughter. But understanding his motives doesn't diminish my conviction that murder is wrong, regardless of provocation." Slack finished his tea. "The prosecutor asked me whether I thought the sentence was appropriate. Life in prison for what amounts to a crime of passion, albeit a very calculated one." "What did you tell him?" Miss Marple asked. "I told him that Reed's planning was so meticulous, so patient, that it transcended passion into something colder. Reed didn't kill Catherine Marsh in a moment of rage or grief. He spent 2 years engineering her death, calculating every detail, waiting for the perfect opportunity. That level of premeditation suggests a transformation from grieving father to determined executioner. The law exists to prevent us from taking such transformations to their logical conclusion." After Slack departed, Miss Marple received another visitor, Dr. Haydock, making his rounds. He seemed troubled, and after the usual pleasantries he broached what was clearly bothering him. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've been thinking about Catherine Marsh's autopsy. I determined she drowned, which is accurate, but I've been wondering whether she was conscious when she went under, whether she suffered, whether there was a moment when she realized this wasn't an accident." "Does it matter?" Miss Marple asked gently. Haydock struggled with the question. "Medically, no. Legally, no. But morally, I keep thinking about those final moments. If she understood this was murder, if she connected it to Sarah Reed, if she felt the weight of her own cruelty catching up to her, does that change anything?" Miss Marple set down her teacup. Dr. Haydock, Catherine Marsh's final moments were undoubtedly terrifying. She plunged through ice into freezing water, became disoriented in darkness, couldn't find the opening through which she'd fallen, and drowned in cold and panic. Whether she understood why this was happening to her doesn't alter the horror of her death. And more importantly, even if she'd achieved some final moment of understanding and remorse, that wouldn't have justified Reed's actions. Murder is murder, regardless of whether the victim achieves enlightenment before dying. The doctor left looking somewhat comforted, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern she was working on was complex, requiring careful attention to ensure each stitch was placed correctly. One mistake early in the work could distort the entire finished piece, creating flaws that couldn't be corrected without unraveling everything and starting over. Rather like life, she reflected. Thomas Reed's mistake, his choice to respond to tragedy with murder, had distorted the pattern of his entire existence. Everything he'd been before Sarah's death, the devoted father, the reliable maintenance chief, the trusted neighbour, all of it was now recontextualized through the lens of what he'd become, a murderer who'd planned and executed a killing with chilling precision. In August, Miss Marple received word that the skating authorities had completed a posthumous investigation into Sarah Reed's doping case. New evidence discovered during the investigation into Catherine Marsh's history suggested that Catherine had indeed orchestrated multiple false doping accusations against competitors. Sarah's name was officially cleared, her ban lifted, her reputation restored. Miss Marple wrote to Thomas Reed informing him of the development. His reply was brief. "Thank you for telling me. Sarah would have been pleased to have her name cleared, but it comes too late to save her life or to prevent me from destroying my own. That's the tragedy, Miss Marple. Catherine's crimes are finally acknowledged, but the acknowledgement can't undo the damage she caused or justify what I did in response." In September, as autumn began to colour the trees, the village council announced that the pond would be opened for skating again when winter arrived, though the Christmas party would remain cancelled. It was time, Marcus Webb explained at the village meeting, to reclaim the pond for the community, to refuse to let one man's actions permanently poison a place that had brought joy to generations. Miss Marple attended the first day of skating that December, watching as hesitant villagers ventured back onto the ice. Children were there, learning to skate under their parents' watchful eyes. Teenagers raced and laughed. Older couples glided hand in hand, reclaiming memories of winters past. The pond was slowly being restored to its proper purpose, though everyone present was acutely aware of the absence of the Christmas party, of the empty spot on the calendar where celebration should have been. As Miss Marple watched the skaters, she reflected on the pattern of the entire case. Catherine Marsh's cruelty had planted seeds that grew into tragedy. Sarah Reed's destroyed career and suicide. Thomas Reed's transformation into a murderer. The Christmas celebration turned into a crime scene. The village's shattered sense of safety, each consequence flowing from Catherine's actions, yet none of them justified. Cruelty explained but didn't excuse revenge. Understanding provided context but didn't diminish culpability. And in the end, multiple lives had been destroyed. Sarah's through false accusations and depression, Catherine's through calculated murder, and Thomas Reed's through his own choice to cross the line from victim to killer. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, she opened her journal and wrote a final entry about the case. The Christmas ice skating party murder revealed something fundamental about human nature, she wrote. We are all capable of darkness when sufficiently provoked. Thomas Reed was not a bad man who committed murder. He was a good man who chose to become a murderer. That distinction matters. It reminds us that our moral character is not fixed, but rather the sum of our choices, particularly the choices we make in our darkest moments. Catherine Marsh chose cruelty repeatedly throughout her career, and those choices accumulated into a pattern of behaviour that destroyed lives. Thomas Reed chose murder once, but that single choice was sufficient to destroy his life and damage his community irreparably. The question each of us must answer is not whether we're capable of such choices, we all are, but whether we'll make them when tested. She closed her journal and picked up her knitting, the needles moving with practiced ease through a pattern she'd completed many times before. Outside her window, snow began to fall, the first of the winter, covering St. Mary Mead in white that would eventually blanket the pond once more. The ice would form again, as it did every year, and people would skate upon it, creating new memories to layer over the terrible one. But Miss Marple knew that beneath the ice, beneath the snow, beneath the surface of normal village life, the memory of what had happened would remain. Thomas Reed had transformed a frozen pond into a murder weapon, had turned a Christmas celebration into a tragedy, and had proven that the capacity for calculated violence existed even in quiet villages among seemingly ordinary people. The lesson, if there was one, was vigilance. Not the vigilance of suspicion, which would poison community as surely as Reed's actions had, but the vigilance of attention. Attention to cruelty and its consequences. Attention to grief and how it transforms people. Attention to the small choices that accumulate into patterns of behaviour, whether those patterns lead toward light or toward darkness. Miss Marple had spent her life observing human nature, and what she'd observed in the case of the Christmas ice skating party murder confirmed what she'd always known. People were capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty. The difference between the two often came down to a single choice, made in a moment of pain or rage or grief. Thomas Reed had made his choice, and it had destroyed him as surely as Catherine Marsh's choices had destroyed Sarah Reed. As the snow continued to fall, Miss Marple reflected that winter would come again and again to St. Mary Mead. The pond would freeze, perhaps children would learn to skate there, perhaps someday the Christmas party would be restored. But the village had been changed by what had happened, had lost something of its innocence, had learned that safety is never guaranteed and that evil can wear the face of a trusted neighbour. These were hard lessons, but necessary ones, Miss Marple thought. Comfortable illusions were pleasant, but they were still illusions. Truth, however uncomfortable, was always preferable to pleasant falsehoods, and the truth of the Christmas ice skating party murder was stark and uncompromising. A father's love had transformed into calculated murder. A woman's cruelty had created her own killer. And a frozen pond, which should have supported celebration, had given way beneath deliberate sabotage, proving once again that the surface appearances of safety and tradition could conceal hidden dangers engineered by patient malice. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily into the quiet evening, creating pattern from chaos, order from complexity, much as she'd done throughout her investigation. The case was closed, justice had been served in its imperfect human way, and St. Mary Mead would continue, changed but enduring. And Miss Marple would continue as well, observing, understanding, and remembering that beneath the placid surface of village life, human nature remained constant in its capacity for both remarkable nobility and shocking darkness. The pond would freeze again when winter returned, but Miss Marple would never look at it without remembering the Christmas when celebration turned to tragedy, when engineering knowledge turned to murder, and when a father's love corrupted into vengeance that destroyed everything it touched. That memory, like the ice itself, would remain cold and clear, a reminder that in even the quietest village, among the most trusted people, darkness could take root and grow until it shattered the frozen surface and dragged the innocent and guilty alike down into the freezing depths below. The end.